The dust kicked up beneath Grace Whitaker's boots as she ran, her breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. Behind her, the town of Sweetwater burned, black smoke billowing into the clear Montana sky. Her father's ranch, everything she'd ever known, was gone, seized by the bank and the corrupt men who ran it. But Grace wasn't running from the flames. She was running from the marriage that awaited her if she stayed a loveless arrangement with Malcolm Pierce, the banker's son, who'd promised to forgive her father's debts in exchange for her hand. The vast plains stretched before her, golden grass bending in the wind. Grace had no destination in mind, only a way. Her satchel bounced against her hip, containing all she'd managed to grab: a change of clothes, her mother's locket, and the small pouch of coins she'd been saving for years. Her lungs burned, but she pushed forward, her skirts hitched up around her knees, indecent but necessary. The sound of hoofbeats made her heart seize. They were coming for her already. Grace didn't look back, just ran faster, her legs pumping, sweat trickling down her back despite the cool autumn air of 1875. The hoofbeats grew louder and then impossibly slowed to match her pace. A horse and rider appeared beside her, keeping perfect time with her desperate flight. "Miss, you'll run yourself to death before you reach the next town," a deep voice called over the sound of her labored breathing. Grace risked a glance sideways. The man rode tall in the saddle, his Stetson pulled low over his eyes. His horse, a magnificent chestnut, pranced easily alongside her, barely exerting itself while she was nearly spent. "Leave me be," Grace gasped, stumbling slightly but catching herself. The cowboy adjusted his hat, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind but not unkind. His eyes, a startling blue against his tanned skin, assessed her with concern rather than judgment. "Name's Wyatt Jones," he said, as if they were meeting at a social rather than in the middle of nowhere while she fled for her freedom. "And you look like you could use a ride." Grace shook her head, pushing herself to run faster. "I don't need help from any man. No offense intended, madam, but those men coming from town might disagree." That made Grace stop abruptly, her chest heaving as she turned to look behind her. In the distance, a cloud of dust revealed several riders, and they weren't taking their time. "Pierce's men," she whispered. Wyatt Jones extended his hand. "I reckon we've got about 2 minutes before they catch up. Your choice." Grace hesitated only a moment before grasping his arm and allowing him to pull her up behind him. The chestnut snorted, but accepted the additional weight without complaint. "Hold tight," Wyatt instructed, and Grace wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him as the horse leapt forward. They rode hard, the plains rushing by in a blur of gold and green. Grace pressed her face against Wyatt's back, the rough fabric of his coat scratching her cheek. She should be frightened, trusting her life to a stranger, but somehow the steady rhythm of the horse and the sure way Wyatt guided it calmed her racing heart. After what felt like hours, when the sun had dipped low in the sky and the pursuing riders were no longer visible, Wyatt slowed the horse to a walk. "You want to tell me why you were running across the plains like the devil himself was after you?" he asked, his voice vibrating through his back into her chest. Grace loosened her grip on his waist but didn't let go entirely. "Malcolm Pierce wants to marry me to settle my father's debts. My father agreed without asking me, and you disagreed." "I'd rather die than be that man's wife," Grace said fiercely. "He's cruel. I've seen how he treats his servants, his horses. I won't be another possession for him to break." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Where are you heading?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. "Away. I have an aunt in Oregon." "Maybe there. Oregon's a far piece from here," Wyatt observed, "and not an easy journey for a woman alone." Grace stiffened. "I can take care of myself." "No doubt," Wyatt said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "But everyone needs help sometimes. I'm heading to a town called Riverspend, about 3 days' ride from here. It's in the opposite direction from Sweetwater. You'd be welcome to ride with me that far." Grace considered her options, which were admittedly few. "Why would you help me? You don't know me," Wyatt shrugged. "My ma raised me to never turn my back on someone in need. Besides, I know Malcolm Pierce. Any woman running from him has good reason." "You know him?" Grace asked sharply. "Our paths have crossed," Wyatt said, his tone darkening. Let's just say we don't see eye to eye on most matters." As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Wyatt guided the horse off the trail toward a small copse of trees beside a narrow stream. "We'll camp here tonight," he said, dismounting gracefully before reaching up to help Grace down. Her legs trembled as her feet touched the ground, unaccustomed to so many hours on horseback. Wyatt steadied her with a hand on her elbow, removing it the moment she found her balance. "Thank you," Grace said, suddenly shy. In the fading light, she could see him more clearly, tall and broad-shouldered, with a strong jaw darkened by stubble. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of the gentleman who came to her father's ranch, but there was something compelling about his face, a quiet strength that put her at ease despite her circumstances. "You're welcome, miss." He raised an eyebrow. "Grace," she supplied. "Grace Whitaker." "Well, Miss Whitaker, I'm afraid I can't offer much in the way of comfort, but I've got jerky and hardtack, and the stream water's clean." "It's more than I expected when I ran," Grace admitted, sinking down onto a fallen log while Wyatt tended to his horse. They ate in companionable silence as darkness fell completely, the stars emerging in a brilliant canopy overhead. Wyatt built a small fire, just enough to ward off the chill but not so large as to be spotted from a distance. "You should get some sleep," he said eventually. "I'll take first watch." Grace nodded, grateful for his consideration. She settled onto the bedroll he'd offered her, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive, her mind racing with thoughts of what she'd left behind and the uncertain future ahead. "Mr. Jones." She whispered after a long while. "Just Wyatt, please," he replied from his position by the fire. "Wyatt, why aren't you afraid they'll come after you too for helping me?" He poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing upward. "I can handle Malcolm Pierce and his kind." "You sound very sure of that." Wyatt's face was half in shadow, the firelight catching the angle of his cheekbone and the set of his mouth. "I've had practice. Get some sleep, Grace. Tomorrow's a long day." Grace closed her eyes, lulled by the crackling of the fire and the soft sounds of the night. For the first time since fleeing Sweetwater, she felt something close to safe. Morning came with dew on the grass and a chill in the air. Grace woke to find Wyatt already up, brewing coffee in a battered tin pot. He offered her a cup without a word, and she took it gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warmth. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, noting the shadows under his eyes. "Enough," he replied. "We should get moving." Pierce isn't the type to give up easily. They rode through the day, Wyatt pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his travels that made Grace laugh despite her worries. He'd been a cattle drover, a ranch hand, even a deputy for a spell in a town over in Wyoming. Now he was heading to Riversbend to help an old friend who'd started a horse ranch and needed experienced hands. "What about you?" he asked as they stopped to rest the horse in the afternoon shade of a lone cottonwood. "What would you do if you weren't running?" Grace thought about it, trailing her fingers through the cool grass. "I'd like to teach. I've always loved books, learning. My mother taught me to read when I was very young, and I used to dream of having a little schoolhouse of my own someday." "That's a fine dream," Wyatt said, his eyes warm as they met hers. "My father thought it was foolishness. He said a woman's place was in the home, raising children, not filling their heads with useless knowledge." Grace's voice was bitter. "Your father sounds like a man with limited vision," Wyatt observed, offering her his canteen. Grace took a sip, the water cool on her parched throat. "He wasn't always like that. After my mother died, something in him hardened. He started drinking, gambling. That's how we ended up in debt to the bank. And to Malcolm Pierce," Wyatt added. Grace nodded, handing back the canteen. "My father thought he was saving me by arranging the marriage. He couldn't see he was condemning me to a life worse than poverty." Wyatt stood, offering his hand to help her up. "Well, you're free of both of them now. That takes courage." Grace accepted his hand, surprised by the calluses that rasped against her palm, or desperation. Sometimes they're the same thing. Wyatt's smile was brief but genuine. "Come on. We've still got daylight to burn." That night, as they camped beneath a rocky outcropping that provided shelter from the wind that had picked up during the day, Grace found herself studying Wyatt as he tended the fire. There was an economy to his movements, a deliberate grace that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. "You said you knew Malcolm Pierce," Grace ventured. How Wyatt's expression darkened. "It's not a pleasant story." "Neither is mine," Grace pointed out. He sighed, settling back against his saddle. "A few years back, I was working at a ranch near the Montana-Wyoming border. Pierce came through with some of his men, looking to buy horses. The ranch owner, Old Man Harlow, didn't like Pierce's offer and refused to sell. A week later, Harlow's barn burned down with most of his stock inside." Grace gasped. "You think Pierce did it?" "I know he did. One of his men got drunk in town and boasted about it. When I confronted Pierce, he denied everything, said his man was lying to impress the saloon girls." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "He offered me money to keep quiet. When I refused, his men caught me alone on the trail one night, beat me pretty bad." "That's terrible," Grace whispered, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. Wyatt's hand covered hers briefly, a gesture of reassurance. "I healed. But I've never forgotten what kind of man Malcolm Pierce is. That's why I didn't think twice about helping you." The next day brought them into more rugged country, with rocky hills breaking up the monotony of the plains. They spoke less, both watchful of their surroundings and conscious of the need to preserve the horse's strength. By evening, Grace's muscles ached from the long hours in the saddle, but she didn't complain. They made camp in a small valley, sheltered by steep slopes on 3 sides. As Wyatt built the fire, Grace gathered wild onions she'd spotted growing near a seep spring. It wasn't much, but it would add flavor to their meager meal. "You're good at that," Wyatt commented as she expertly cleaned and sliced the onions with her small pocket knife. "My mother taught me which plants were useful. She learned from a Crow woman who worked for my grandfather when she was young." Grace added the onions to the pot of beans Wyatt had set to boil. She believed in being self-sufficient, not relying on men for everything. "A wise woman," Wyatt said, settling beside her. "My mother was the same way. After my father died, she ran our small farm on her own for years. Wouldn't hear of remarrying, though she had offers." "Is she still alive?" Grace asked. "No," Wyatt's voice softened. "Consumption took her 5 winters ago. I was in Colorado when it happened, didn't make it back in time." "I'm sorry," Grace said simply. Wyatt nodded his acknowledgement. "Life out here is hard, makes the good moments all the more precious." They ate their simple meal as darkness fell, the fire casting dancing shadows on the valley walls around them. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the black velvet sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, the sound lonely and wild. "We should reach Riverspend by tomorrow afternoon," Wyatt said as they finished eating. "It's a small place but decent. You could rest there, figure out your next steps." Grace nodded, though the thought of parting ways with Wyatt brought an unexpected pang. In just 2 days, she'd grown accustomed to his quiet presence, the sense of security he provided. "What will you do if Pierce's men come to Riverspend looking for me?" she asked. "They won't find you," Wyatt said with quiet confidence. "My friend Thomas has a cabin on his property where you can stay. It's set back in the trees, out of sight. You'd be safe there until you decide where to go next." Grace stared into the fire, watching the flames lick at the dry wood. "I've been thinking about that. Oregon is so far, and I barely know my aunt. She might not welcome me turning up on her doorstep." "What about staying in Riverspend?" Wyatt suggested. "It's a growing town, might need a teacher soon." The idea took root in Grace's mind, blooming with possibility. "Do you think that's possible?" "I think anything's possible for someone brave enough to run across the plains rather than accept a life that would break her spirit," Wyatt said, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight as they met hers. Grace felt a flush rise to her cheeks, not entirely due to the fire's warmth. There was admiration in his gaze and something else, something that made her heart beat a little faster. "I should check on the horse," Wyatt said suddenly, rising to his feet. "Rest if you can. I'll take first watch again." As he moved away, Grace watched him go, aware of a growing feeling inside her that had nothing to do with fear or uncertainty. She'd known Wyatt Jones for only 2 days, yet she trusted him more than any man she'd ever met. Dawn brought a changed landscape. Overnight, clouds had gathered, heavy and gray, promising rain. They packed up quickly, eager to reach Riverspend before the weather turned. "The horse is tiring," Wyatt observed as they rode. "We've pushed him hard." "We can slow down," Grace suggested. "I don't mind the rain." Wyatt glanced at her, his expression softening. "You're tougher than you look, Grace Whitaker." "I had to be," she replied simply. They traveled in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the distant rumble of thunder. The first raindrops began to fall mid-morning, fat drops that quickly gave way to a steady downpour. Wyatt urged the horse toward a stand of trees that offered some shelter, dismounting and helping Grace down. They huddled beneath the densest part of the canopy, but the rain found its way through, soaking them nonetheless. "Some adventure I've led you on," Wyatt said ruefully, watching as Grace wrung water from her skirts. Despite the discomfort, Grace found herself laughing. "Still better than marrying Malcolm Pierce." Wyatt's answering smile warmed her more than any fire could. "You've got spirit, that's for certain." They stood close together, sharing what little shelter the trees provided. Grace was acutely aware of Wyatt's presence beside her, the rise and fall of his chest as he breathed, the droplets of water clinging to his eyelashes. "We should keep moving," he said after a time, though he made no move to step away. "The rain won't let up anytime soon." Grace nodded but didn't move either. Something was happening between them, something unspoken but powerful. His eyes held hers, and the rest of the world seemed to fade away. A sharp crack of thunder broke the spell, startling the horse. Wyatt moved quickly to calm the animal, and the moment passed. They rode through the rain, both soaked to the skin but determined to reach Riverspend. By early afternoon, the downpour had slowed to a drizzle, and the landscape began to change, becoming more wooded as they approached the foothills. "There," Wyatt pointed as they crested a small rise. Below them lay a valley with a river winding through it, and nestled alongside the water, the town of Riverspend. It wasn't much to look at a main street with perhaps 20 buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, a church steeple rising above the other structures, but to Grace, it looked like possibility. "It's lovely," she said softly. "It's growing," Wyatt replied. "The railroad's coming through next year." "Thomas says they're already talking about building a proper school." Grace's heart leapt at the words. "Really?" Wyatt nodded, guiding the horse down the slope toward town. "Thomas will know more." His wife, Sarah, has been teaching the children in their front room for now, but she's expecting their third child and would welcome the help, I'd wager. As they rode into town, Grace took in the sights with eager eyes. Despite the recent rain, people were out and about, going about their business. A general store, a blacksmith shop, what looked like a small hotel, and yes, a saloon, its doors open despite the early hour. They drew curious looks as they passed, a bedraggled pair on a tired horse. Wyatt nodded greetings to a few people, suggesting he'd been here before and was remembered. "Thomas's place is just outside town," he explained, guiding the horse past the last buildings and onto a dirt road that followed the river. "He's got the best grazing land in the valley." After about a mile, a large ranch house came into view, set back from the road with a barn and several corrals nearby. As they approached, a tall man emerged from the barn, shading his eyes against the weak sunlight that had broken through the clouds. "Wyatt Jones, as I live and breathe." The man called, striding toward them. "You're a week early and twice as wet as expected." Wyatt dismounted, grinning as he clasped the man's hand. "Thomas Reed, you haven't changed a bit." "Can't say the same for you. You've got more gray than when I saw you last," Thomas joked, then turned his attention to Grace, still seated on the horse. "And who might this be?" Wyatt's expression grew serious. "This is Miss Grace Whitaker. She's in a bit of trouble, and I was hoping you and Sarah might help her out." Thomas's friendly face showed immediate concern. "Any friend of Wyatt's is welcome here, Miss Whitaker. Come inside, both of you. Sarah will have hot coffee and dry clothes." Grace allowed Wyatt to help her down, her legs stiff from the long ride. As they followed Thomas toward the house, Wyatt leaned close to murmur, "Thomas and Sarah are good people. You can trust them." Inside, the Reed home was warm and inviting, with a large fireplace and comfortable furnishings. Sarah Reed, a petite woman with a visible pregnancy and kind eyes, took one look at them, and immediately set about finding dry clothes and stoking the fire. While Grace changed into a borrowed dress in a small bedroom, she could hear the murmur of voices from the main room, Wyatt explaining her situation to the Reeds. By the time she emerged, feeling human again with dry clothes and her hair combed, Sarah was serving bowls of stew at the table, and the men were deep in conversation. "You're more than welcome to stay as long as you need, Grace," Sarah said warmly as Grace joined them. "The cabin Wyatt mentioned is small but comfortable. It was the original homestead before Thomas built this house." "I can't thank you enough," Grace said, overwhelmed by their kindness. "No thanks needed," Thomas replied. "Wyatt saved my life once upon a time. Any friend of his is family to us." Grace glanced at Wyatt, who seemed embarrassed by the mention. "It wasn't as dramatic as all that," he demurred. "He pulled me from a burning building during a cattle town riot," Thomas told Grace. "Carried me out while bullets were flying. I'd say that's dramatic enough." Wyatt changed the subject, asking about the horses Thomas was breeding, but Grace filed the information away, another piece of the puzzle that was Wyatt Jones. After the meal, Thomas showed them to the cabin, a sturdy structure tucked into a grove of pines about a quarter-mile from the main house. It was simple but well built, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a table with chairs, and a bed in the corner. "It's not fancy, but it's quiet," Thomas said. "No one would think to look for you here, Miss Whitaker." "It's perfect," Grace assured him. "I can't tell you how grateful I am." "I'll send Sarah down with some supplies in the morning," Thomas said. "For tonight, there's firewood stacked outside and the pantry has some basics." After Thomas left, Wyatt built a fire while Grace explored the small space that would be her sanctuary for now. The normalcy of it, four walls, a roof, a bed with clean linens, felt like unimaginable luxury after days on the run. "Will you stay in the main house?" she asked Wyatt, who was coaxing the kindling to catch. He nodded. "Thomas has a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. I'll be there." "Oh." Grace wasn't sure why that disappointed her. Of course. The fire caught, flames licking up around the dry pine. Wyatt stood, dusting off his hands. "You'll be safe here, Grace. Thomas and Sarah are the best people I know." "Because of you," Grace said quietly. "If you hadn't been there when I was running, you'd have found another way," Wyatt said with conviction. "You're stronger than you know." Grace moved closer, drawn to him by something she couldn't name. "Thank you, not just for the rescue, but for seeing me, really seeing me." Wyatt's eyes were dark in the firelight, his face solemn. "How could anyone not see you, Grace? You shine brighter than anyone I've ever known." The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. Grace's heart hammered in her chest as Wyatt took a step toward her, then stopped, uncertainty in his expression. "I should go," he said, though he didn't move. "Let you rest." "What if I don't want you to go?" Grace whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. Wyatt's breath caught audibly. "Grace," a knock at the door interrupted whatever he was about to say. They sprang apart as Thomas's voice called, "Wyatt, Sarah sent down some extra blankets. It gets cold at night this time of year." The moment broken, Wyatt crossed to the door and accepted the blankets from Thomas. After a brief exchange, he closed the door and turned back to Grace, a new guardedness in his manner. "I really should let you get settled," he said, placing the blankets on the bed. "It's been a long few days." Grace wanted to recapture the moment that had passed, but didn't know how. Instead, she nodded. "Will I see you tomorrow?" "Of course," Wyatt said, his smile returning. "Thomas wants to show me his new stallion, and then I promised to help fix a section of fence, but I'll come by in the evening if that's all right." "I'd like that," Grace said. After Wyatt left, Grace sat by the fire for a long time, thinking about the turn her life had taken in just 3 days. She'd fled a forced marriage, crossed the plains with a stranger who'd become something more, and found herself in a place that already felt more like home than the ranch where she'd grown up. And then, there was Wyatt himself, a man unlike any she'd known before. Honorable, kind, with a quiet strength that drew her like a moth to flame. Grace hugged her knees to her chest, acknowledging the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with him. The realization should have frightened her. After all, she barely knew him. But somehow it felt right, as if she'd been waiting her whole life to meet someone who saw her completely and valued what he saw. But did he feel the same? The moment by the fire suggested he might, but Wyatt was a gentleman. Perhaps he was simply being kind to a woman in distress. Grace sighed, watching the flames dance. Tomorrow she would begin to build her new life here, and perhaps, if she was brave enough, she would discover if Wyatt Jones might be part of that life. The next day dawned clear and cool, the rain having washed the world clean. Grace woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows, feeling rested for the first time in days. She just finished dressing when a knock came at the door. Sarah Reed stood on the threshold, a basket over one arm and her young son and daughter peering curiously from behind her skirts. "Good morning," Sarah greeted her warmly. "I've brought you some breakfast and these two curious creatures who couldn't wait to meet our visitor." The children, a boy of about 6 and a girl, perhaps 4, regarded Grace with wide eyes as their mother made introductions. "This is Benjamin and Alina. Children, this is Miss Whitaker." "You can call me Grace," she told them with a smile, kneeling to their level. "It's very nice to meet you. Are you running from bad men?" Benjamin asked bluntly, earning a mortified "Benjamin" from his mother. Grace laughed. "I was, but I'm safe now, thanks to Mr. Jones and your parents." This seemed to satisfy the boy, who nodded seriously. "Papa says Mr. Jones is the bravest man he knows. He can shoot a rattlesnake at 50 paces. "That's quite impressive," Grace agreed, though she suspected Wyatt's marksmanship had been exaggerated in the telling. "Children, why don't you go help your father gather eggs while I speak with Miss Grace?" Sarah suggested, and with reluctant nods the children scampered off. Sarah set the basket on the table. "I've brought bread, eggs, some preserved fruit. We'll go into town later today to get you more supplies. Wyatt told us you left with very little." "That's very kind," Grace said, helping Sarah unpack the basket. "I have some money." "Not much, but enough to pay for my keep until I can find work." Sarah waved this away. "There's plenty of time for that. First, you need to rest, recover from your journey." She settled into one of the chairs, resting a hand on her rounded belly. "Wyatt told us a little of your situation." "This Malcolm Pierce sounds like a dreadful man." "He is," Grace confirmed, sitting across from her. "I couldn't bear the thought of being tied to him for life." "Well, you're safe here," Sarah assured her. "Riversbend is a small town, but we look after our own," she smiled. "And anyone Wyatt Jones vouches for is as good as family." "You and Thomas think very highly of him," Grace observed, "with good reason. He's one of the finest men I've ever known, second only to my Thomas." Sarah's gaze was knowing. "And I think he thinks rather highly of you as well." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We've only known each other a few days." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Sarah said gently. "Thomas and I knew within a week, when it's right, it's right." She stood, smoothing her dress. "Now eat your breakfast. Once you're ready, come up to the house." "I'd welcome the help with some mending, and it would give us a chance to talk more." The day passed pleasantly. Grace helped Sarah with household tasks, played with the children, and even assisted Thomas with treating a horse's injured leg when he discovered she had a way with animals. Wyatt was absent, having ridden out early with one of the ranch hands to check fences on the property's far boundary. By late afternoon, Sarah declared it was time to go into town for supplies. Grace felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of being seen, but Sarah reassured her. Riversbend isn't the kind of place where strangers are noticed much. The mining camps to the north send men through regularly, and the stage brings travelers. Besides, she added with a twinkle in her eye, everyone will be too busy gossiping about Mrs. Henderson's new hat to pay attention to us. The town was busier than it had appeared during their rain-soaked arrival. The general store was well stocked, and Sarah introduced Grace to the proprietor, Mr. Finch, as a friend from back east, staying with us for a time. As they browsed the store's offerings, selecting fabric, food staples, and other necessities, Grace couldn't help overhearing a conversation between two men near the counter. "Riding with Malcolm Pierce, asking questions all over the territory. Looking for some gal who ran off," one was saying. "Pierce's men cause trouble wherever they go," the other replied. "Sheriff Watson over in Blackrock said they nearly started a riot in the saloon there 2 nights ago." Grace's blood ran cold. She turned away, pretending to examine a bolt of calico while straining to hear more. "What's the gal to Pierce, his wife?" "Nah, betrothed or some such. Apparently, her pa owed Pierce money, offered her as payment, and she took off. Can't blame her, from what I hear of Pierce. Well, they won't find much welcome here if they come asking. Pierce has no friends in Riverspend, not after what happened with the Wilkins place. Sarah touched Grace's arm, startling her. Everything all right? You've gone pale. They're talking about me, Grace whispered, nodding toward the men. Sarah's expression hardened. Let's finish up and get back to the ranch. Thomas and Wyatt need to know about this. They completed their purchases quickly and headed back, Sarah driving the wagon with a determination that belied her delicate appearance. When they arrived, Thomas and Wyatt were in the corral, working with a spirited young mare. Thomas, Sarah called, her voice urgent. We need to talk. The men exchanged glances and came to the wagon. Wyatt's eyes immediately sought Grace's, concern evident when he saw her distress. What's happened? He asked, helping her down from the wagon. Sarah explained what they'd overheard, her voice tight with worry. If Pierce's men are asking questions in the territory, it's only a matter of time before they come to Riverspend. Thomas's expression grew grim. We won't let them near her. It's not just about Grace, Sarah pointed out. If these men are as dangerous as you've said, they could cause trouble for the whole town. Wyatt was quiet, his face unreadable as he considered the situation. Grace, do you still have family in Oregon? He asked finally. Grace nodded. My mother's sister. I haven't seen her since I was a child, but we exchanged letters occasionally. The stage goes through to Portland twice a month, Thomas said. Next one's due in 3 days. The suggestion was clear, and Grace felt a pang of dismay. She'd just begun to feel at home here, to imagine a future in Riverspend. The thought of leaving Wyatt hurt more than she'd expected. No, Wyatt said suddenly, surprising them all. Running isn't the answer. It's what Pierce wants to drive you away to make you keep running. But if his men come here, Grace began. Then we'll deal with them, Wyatt said firmly. You have friends here now, Grace. You don't have to face this alone. Thomas nodded in agreement. Wyatt's right, and Pierce has no legal claim on you. You're a free woman, not property to be traded for debts. The sheriff should be told, Sarah suggested. Jim Carson's a good man. He won't stand for Pierce's men causing trouble in his town. Hope began to replace the fear in Grace's heart. These people who barely knew her were willing to stand with her against Malcolm Pierce. And Wyatt wasn't sending her away. All right, she said, drawing strength from their support. I'm tired of running. That evening, after a tense discussion around the Reeds' dinner table where plans were made for various contingencies, Wyatt walked Grace back to the cabin. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet sky, the air fresh with the scent of pine. Are you sure about this? Grace asked as they followed the path through the trees. Staying could bring trouble to all of you. I've never been more sure of anything, Wyatt replied, his voice low in the darkness. Some things are worth fighting for. They reached the cabin, but neither made a move to go inside. Instead, they stood in the small clearing, the moonlight casting dappled shadows through the pine boughs. Why are you doing this? Grace asked. You barely know me. Wyatt took a step closer, close enough that she could see the play of emotions across his face. I know enough. I know you're brave and kind. I know you laugh at my terrible jokes and you don't complain even when you're exhausted. I know you treat Thomas's children with patience and his horses with respect. He took another step, and now they were standing toe-to-toe, his eyes locked on hers. I know that when I saw you running across those plains, something inside me recognized you, as if I'd been waiting for you without even knowing it. Grace's heart hammered in her chest. Wyatt, I'm falling in love with you, Grace Whitaker, he said simply. I know it's too soon, that you have every reason to be cautious, but it's the truth all the same. The world seemed to still around them as his words hung in the air. Grace could hear her own pulse, the soft whisper of pine needles in the night breeze, the distant call of an owl. It's not too soon, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face, the stubble rough beneath her fingertips. I've been falling since the moment you rode beside me, matching my pace when anyone else would have ridden past or tried to stop me. Wyatt's hand covered hers, turning to press a kiss to her palm. I couldn't have ridden past you if I'd tried. When he kissed her, it was gentle, almost reverent, as if she were something precious he feared might break. Grace leaned into him, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him. The kiss deepened, became something hungry and needful, a promise of more to come. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said, though his arms remained around her waist. "Stay," Grace whispered. "Just to talk. I don't want to be alone tonight." Inside the cabin, they sat before the fire, talking into the small hours. Wyatt told her about his childhood on a small farm in Missouri, his years working the cattle drives, the dreams he'd once had of his own ranch. Grace shared stories of her mother, the books she loved, the small acts of rebellion that had always gotten her into trouble with her father. "I want to build something here," Wyatt said as the fire burned low. "Something lasting. Thomas has offered me a partnership in his horse breeding business. With the railroad coming, there'll be good money in quality stock. And I want to teach," Grace said. "To help children see beyond the boundaries of this valley, to dream bigger dreams." "We could do those things together," Wyatt suggested, his voice careful, hopeful. Grace turned to look at him, this man who'd changed her life in the space of a few days. "I'd like that very much." They fell asleep there, beside the dying fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her. It was innocent and intimate all at once, a promise of the life they might build together. The next day brought Sheriff Jim Carson to the Reed Ranch, a tall, weathered man with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Thomas had ridden into town early to speak with him, and the sheriff had come straight away to hear Grace's story firsthand. "Malcolm Pierce has no legal authority to pursue you," the sheriff confirmed after listening to her account. "Your father's debts are his own concern, and he has no right to promise you in marriage without your consent." "But Pierce isn't a man who cares much about legal authority," Wyatt pointed out. Sheriff Carson nodded grimly. "I'm aware of his reputation. That's why I've sent telegrams to the sheriffs in neighboring counties, warning them to be on the lookout for his men. And I've deputized 2 more men in town, just in case." The sheriff's visit reassured Grace somewhat, but the knowledge that Pierce's men were actively searching for her still left her on edge. For the next 2 days, she stayed close to the ranch, helping Sarah with the children and household tasks, spending evenings with Wyatt, getting to know each other better with each passing hour. On the morning of the 3rd day, Thomas rode into town to check for any news. He returned with a grim expression that told them all something was wrong before he even dismounted. "Pierce's men were spotted in Clearwater yesterday," he reported, referring to a town about 20 miles east. 5 of them, asking questions about a young woman traveling with a tall cowboy. "That's not much to go on," Wyatt observed. "Could be anyone." "They had your descriptions," Thomas said bluntly. "Someone in Sweetwater must have seen you leave together." Grace felt cold despite the warm spring day. "They'll come here next." "Most likely," Thomas agreed. "The stage for Portland leaves tomorrow. You could both be on it." Grace looked at Wyatt, saw the determination in his eyes and knew he wouldn't run, and neither would she, not anymore. "No," she said firmly. "This is where I want to be. I won't let Malcolm Pierce chase me away from the first place that's felt like home in years." Wyatt's smile was worth any risk. "Then we stand our ground." Sheriff Carson organized a watch rotation among his deputies and trusted townsmen, keeping an eye on the roads into Riverspend. Thomas moved his valuable horses to the back pasture, away from the main road, and made sure all the ranch hands were alert to strangers. Grace insisted on continuing with her normal activities, refusing to hide away in the cabin. "If I cower in fear, Pierce has already won," she told Wyatt when he expressed concern. 2 more days passed without incident, and some of the tension began to ease. Grace even accompanied Sarah into town to attend a meeting of the Ladies' Aid Society, where Sarah introduced her as a potential teacher. The women were welcoming, especially when they learned of Grace's education and experience helping in her mother's informal classes for ranch children. "Mrs. Bennett is on the town council," Sarah explained as they drove home. "She was very impressed with you. I wouldn't be surprised if they offer you the teaching position once the schoolhouse is built." "That would be wonderful," Grace said, allowing herself to imagine it a classroom of her own, children eager to learn, a life built on her own terms. They were about halfway back to the ranch when Sarah suddenly pulled the wagon to a halt. "Riders coming," she said, pointing to a dust cloud on the road ahead. Grace's heart sank as the riders came into view, 5 men, moving fast, heading straight for them. Even at a distance, she recognized the lead rider, Malcolm Pierce himself, his distinctive white hat visible against the blue sky. "Turn around," Grace urged, "quickly before they see us." But it was too late. The riders had spotted them and were now galloping toward the wagon. Sarah flicked the reins, turning the wagon in a tight circle, but the road was narrow, bordered by ditches on both sides. By the time they were facing back toward town, Pierce and his men had nearly reached them. "Well, well," Pierce called as they approached, his voice carrying on the still air. "If it isn't the runaway bride." He was much as Grace remembered, tall and lean, with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. He reined his horse to a stop in front of the wagon, blocking their path. "Mr. Pierce," Grace acknowledged, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I am not and never was your bride." Pierce's smile tightened. "Your father gave his word, Miss Whitaker. A debt is a debt." "I am not property to be traded," Grace replied, anger giving her courage. "My father had no right to promise me to anyone." Pierce's eyes shifted to Sarah. "Madam, this is a private matter between Miss Whitaker and myself. I suggest you allow her to come with us and avoid any unpleasantness." Sarah's chin lifted defiantly. "Miss Whitaker is under the protection of my family and this town, Mr. Pierce. You have no authority here." One of Pierce's men moved his horse forward, hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Boss doesn't need authority. He takes what's his." "That's enough, Harley," Pierce said, though his eyes remained hard. "We're civilized men. I'm sure we can resolve this without resorting to violence." He turned back to Grace. "Your father's health is failing, Miss Whitaker. He's asking for you. Come home, fulfill your obligation, and all debts will be forgiven." The mention of her father struck Grace like a physical blow. Despite everything, he was still her father. Is he truly ill? "Gravely so," Pierce said solemnly, though something in his eyes made Grace doubt his sincerity. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching riders made them all turn. Wyatt and Thomas were galloping toward them, followed by 2 of Thomas's ranch hands. They pulled their horses to a stop a short distance away, assessing the situation. "Everything all right here, Sarah?" Thomas called, his hand resting near his own pistol. "Mr. Pierce was just leaving," Sarah replied firmly. Pierce's eyes narrowed as he recognized Wyatt Jones. "Should have known you'd be involved. Still sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, I see. Still threatening women and burning barns, Pierce," Wyatt replied coolly. "Some things never change." The tension in the air was palpable, 5 men on each side, the women caught in between. Grace could see Wyatt calculating odds, his expression grim. "There's no need for this to get ugly," Pierce said, though his hand had moved closer to his gun. "Miss Whitaker comes with me, the rest of you go on with your day." "That's not happening," Wyatt stated, his voice calm but unyielding. Pierce's face darkened. "You're outnumbered, Jones." "I wouldn't be so sure," came a new voice, and Sheriff Carson rode into view from a side trail, 3 deputies with him. "Thought I might find you here, Pierce. You've got quite a reputation preceding you." Pierce's men exchanged uneasy glances, clearly not having anticipated this turn of events. Pierce himself maintained his composure, though his jaw tightened visibly. "Sheriff, I'm simply retrieving a young woman who ran away from her responsibilities," Pierce explained smoothly. "Her father is gravely ill and has requested her return." "That's so," the sheriff looked to Grace. "Miss Whitaker, do you wish to go with this man?" "No," Grace said firmly. "My father sold me to settle his gambling debts. I won't be treated as property." The sheriff nodded, as if this confirmed what he already knew. "Mr. Pierce, I'm going to have to ask you and your men to leave Riverspend. We don't take kindly to intimidation in these parts." "This isn't over," Pierce said, his eyes cold as they focused on Grace, then Wyatt. "A debt is still a debt. Any legitimate debt can be settled in court," Sheriff Carson replied. "Now move along, or I'll have to arrest you for threatening these good people." For a moment, it seemed Pierce might resist, but a calculating look came into his eyes. With a slight nod to his men, he turned his horse. "We'll be going, Sheriff, for now." His gaze lingered on Grace. "Think about your father, Miss Whitaker. He doesn't have much time." They watched in tense silence as Pierce and his men rode away, not relaxing until they were out of sight. The sheriff moved his horse alongside the wagon. "They'll probably make camp outside town, wait for a chance to catch you alone," he told Grace. "I'd advise staying at the ranch for a few days. I'll keep men watching the roads." "Thank you, Sheriff," Grace said, still shaken by the confrontation. Wyatt rode to the wagon, his concerned eyes meeting Grace's. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "I am now." They returned to the ranch, the sheriff and one deputy accompanying them while the others followed Pierce's group to ensure they left the immediate area. Once back at the house, Thomas organized the ranch hands into a watch rotation, while Sarah made coffee and tried to lighten the mood for the children's sake. Later, when the sheriff had gone and the children were in bed, the adults gathered in the Reed's parlor to discuss what had happened. "Pierce won't give up easily," Wyatt said, pacing before the fireplace. "He's not the type to accept defeat. But he can't force Grace to go with him," Sarah pointed out, not with the sheriff aware of the situation. "He could try to take her by force," Thomas said grimly. "Men like Pierce don't always play by the rules." Grace, who had been quiet since their return, finally spoke. "What if my father really is ill? What if he's dying?" The room fell silent. It was Wyatt who finally answered, his voice gentle. "Would you want to see him, if we could arrange it safely?" Grace considered the question. Despite everything, Walter Whitaker was her father, the only family she had left besides the distant aunt in Oregon. "I don't know. Part of me says he forfeited any right to my concern when he tried to sell me to settle his debts, but another part understands he's still your father," Wyatt finished for her. "Family is complicated." "What if I wrote to him?" Grace suggested. "The sheriff could have the letter delivered. If father truly wants to see me because he's ill, not because of Pierce's scheme, he could come here." Thomas nodded approvingly. "That's sensible. Puts the choice in your hands, not Pierce's." The next morning, Grace wrote the letter, pouring her heart onto the page, her hurt at his betrayal, her new life in Riverspend, her willingness to see him if he truly wished reconciliation. Sheriff Carson promised to have it delivered by a trusted deputy. Life at the Reed Ranch settled into a wary routine. Grace continued to help Sarah with the children and household tasks, and even began giving informal lessons to Benjamin and Alina each morning. Wyatt worked with Thomas's horses, showing a natural gift for training that impressed even the most experienced ranch hands. In the evenings, Wyatt and Grace would walk along the river or sit on the cabin's small porch, talking about everything and nothing, their hopes, their fears, the life they were beginning to envision together. A week passed with no word from Pierce or her father. Then 2 weeks. The constant vigilance began to ease, though Sheriff Carson maintained regular patrols on the roads into town. Grace found herself thriving in Riverspend. The town council, impressed by her background and Sarah's recommendation, officially offered her the position of schoolteacher once the new schoolhouse was completed in the fall. In the meantime, she would assist Sarah with lessons for the town's children. One evening, as May gave way to June and the days grew longer and warmer, Wyatt took Grace on a picnic beside the river, in a secluded spot where the water pooled calm and deep before continuing its journey downstream. "Thomas has offered me a full partnership in the horse business," Wyatt told her as they sat on a blanket spread beneath a cottonwood tree. "With my experience and his breeding stock, he thinks we could build something special here." "That's wonderful," Grace exclaimed, genuinely happy for him. "You've worked so hard and you have such a way with the horses. It means I'm staying in Riverspend," Wyatt said, taking her hand, "putting down roots for the first time in my life." The significance of his words wasn't lost on Grace. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I've grown rather fond of Riverspend myself." "Just Riverspend?" Wyatt teased, bringing her hand to his lips. "Well, the scenery is quite appealing," Grace replied with a smile. "Especially certain tall, blue-eyed parts of it." Wyatt laughed, but his eyes were serious as they held hers. "I love you, Grace Whitaker. I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." "I love you too," Grace said, the words coming easily, naturally. "You saw me when I was running scared across the plains, and instead of trying to stop me or tell me what to do, you matched my pace. You've been matching my pace ever since." Wyatt reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I had this made in town," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a single pearl. "It's not fancy, it's perfect," Grace breathed, her heart in her throat. "Grace Whitaker, will you marry me? Build a life with me here, teach the children of Riverspend, grow old with me on this river?" "Yes," Grace whispered, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Yes to all of it." The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit. When Wyatt kissed her, it felt like a promise, a beginning, a future unfolding before them. They returned to the ranch hand in hand, their joy evident. Sarah spotted the ring immediately and let out a delighted cry, embracing them both, while Thomas shook Wyatt's hand with a knowing grin. "About time," he said. "I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the barn together." The next few weeks passed in a happy blur as plans were made for a wedding in late summer. The schoolhouse construction began, and Grace spent her days divided between helping Sarah, planning lessons, and dreaming of her future with Wyatt. It was on a warm July afternoon, as Grace was hanging laundry behind the cabin, that she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw a single rider coming down the path from the main house, not Wyatt or Thomas, but an older man she didn't recognize. As he drew closer, however, recognition dawned, and Grace's heart constricted. Walter Whitaker had aged a decade in the month since she'd last seen him, his once robust frame now gaunt, his face deeply lined. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he dismounted with obvious difficulty. "You look like your mother." Grace stood frozen, the wet sheet forgotten in her hands. "Father, I didn't expect. My letter, I got it," he confirmed. "Took me a while to travel here. My health." He gestured vaguely at himself, and Grace could see now that he moved like a man in pain. "You are ill," she said, the realization bringing a complex mix of emotions, vindication that Pierce hadn't lied about that, at least, but also genuine concern. "Cancer, the doctor says," Walter replied bluntly. "Not long now." Grace's throat tightened. Whatever his sins, this was her father facing his mortality. "Come inside," she said, setting aside the laundry. "You must be tired from your journey." Inside the cabin, Walter sank gratefully into a chair while Grace made coffee. They were silent as she worked, the air heavy with unspoken words. "Your letter said you're teaching," Walter finally said. "Your mother would be proud." Grace turned to face him, coffee pot in hand. "And you, are you proud, father, or just disappointed that your investment ran away?" Walter flinched as if struck. "I deserve that." "I deserved every angry word in your letter and more." The raw honesty in his voice surprised her. Grace poured the coffee and sat across from him. "Why did you come?" "The truth, please." "To apologize," Walter said simply. "To see you one last time, to tell you I was wrong." He looked down at his gnarled hands. "After your mother died, I lost myself in drink and cards. I thought I could win back what we'd lost. Instead, I lost more, including my daughter's respect." Grace's anger, nursed for so long, began to soften at the edges. "What about Pierce?" "He came looking for me." Walter's expression darkened. "Malcolm Pierce is a devil. I didn't see it at first. By the time I realized what kind of man he was, I was in too deep. When I fell ill, he saw his chance to press his advantage. Did you tell him where to find me?" Grace asked, the question that had been troubling her. "No," Walter said firmly. "I never told him about your aunt in Oregon. He must have had you followed when you left Sweetwater. After your letter arrived, I slipped away without telling him. He'll be furious when he discovers I'm gone." They talked for hours, painful truths coming to light. Walter had indeed gambled away the ranch, but Pierce had manipulated the games, ensuring Walter's losses mounted. The marriage arrangement had been Pierce's idea, presented as the only way to settle the debt and allow Walter to die with a roof over his head. "I was weak," Walter admitted. "I told myself it was for your security, that Pierce could provide for you after I was gone. But that was a lie I told myself to ease my conscience." As they talked, Wyatt returned from working with the horses. Grace made introductions, watching as her father sized up the man she loved. "So you're the cowboy who rode beside my daughter when she ran," Walter said, his shrewd eyes taking in Wyatt's straightforward gaze and steady demeanor. Yes, sir, Wyatt replied without apology. Best decision I ever made. A ghost of a smile touched Walter's lips. I can see why she chose you. Walter's visit stretched from 1 day to 3 as father and daughter began the slow, difficult work of reconciliation. He was clearly ill, tiring easily and sometimes in obvious pain, though he tried to hide it. When Grace suggested he see the town doctor, he shook his head. Nothing to be done but make peace with those I've wronged, he said, you being first among them. On the third evening, as they sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset, Walter turned to Grace with a serious expression. There's something else I need to tell you. Grace waited, sensing the importance of what was to come. Pierce doesn't just want you because of some twisted sense of ownership, Walter said, his voice low. Your mother left you something valuable that Pierce wants badly. Grace frowned in confusion. Mother had nothing of value. Her jewelry was sold years ago. Not jewelry, Walter shook his head. Land, 100 acres in northern Wyoming near the Montana border, land that's worthless for farming but sits atop a substantial coal deposit. Grace stared at him in shock. Mother owned land, how did I never know this? It was her secret, Walter explained. Land her father left her in her name only. She made me promise never to touch it to save it for you. It was the one promise to her I kept. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. The deed in your mother's name. After her death, it should have transferred to you, but I kept it locked away, ashamed of how I'd squandered everything else she'd trusted me with. Grace took the yellowed paper with trembling hands. And Pierce found out about it, Walter nodded grimly. Last year, when the railroad surveyors came through. They're planning a spur line that would make that coal easily transportable. The land's value increased tenfold overnight. Pierce has been buying up everything he can in the area. So when he couldn't buy it, he tried to marry it, Wyatt observed from where he leaned against the porch railing. Exactly, Walter confirmed. By marrying Grace, he'd gain control of her property. That's why he's so determined to find you. Grace looked at the deed in her hands, her mother's maiden name clearly visible. 100 acres of Wyoming wilderness her birthright, hidden all these years. The enormity of it was difficult to grasp. This changes things, Wyatt said quietly. Pierce won't give up easily if there's that much money at stake. No, he won't, Walter agreed. That's why I came as soon as I could, to warn you and to give you what's rightfully yours. He took Grace's hand, his own papery and cool. Do what you want with the land, Grace. Sell it, keep it, it's yours to decide, but be careful. Pierce is dangerous when thwarted. Grace squeezed her father's hand. Thank you for telling me the truth, for coming all this way. Walter's smile was tinged with sadness. It's little enough after everything. The next morning, Walter's condition had worsened. The town doctor was summoned and confirmed what they all suspected: Walter had little time left. At Walter's request, a telegram was sent to Sweetwater, informing his housekeeper of his whereabouts, but with strict instructions not to tell Pierce. I don't want him following me here, Walter explained. Let him think I've gone to Denver for treatment. For the next week, Grace divided her time between preparations for the new school term and sitting with her father, whose strength ebbed a little more each day. They talked more in that week than they had in years, healing old wounds, sharing memories of her mother, finding a measure of peace in forgiveness. Wyatt was a constant presence, supportive without intruding, helping move Walter to the main house when he became too weak to walk between buildings, sitting up with him through difficult nights when Grace finally succumbed to exhaustion. On a peaceful morning in late July, Walter Whitaker passed away in his sleep, Grace holding one hand and Wyatt the other. His last words had been to Wyatt, "Take care of my girl, do better by her than I did." "I will, sir," Wyatt had promised, "every day of my life." They buried Walter in the small town cemetery, the service attended by the Reeds, Sheriff Carson, and a handful of townspeople who had come to know Grace. Standing beside the fresh grave, Grace felt a complex mixture of grief and relief: grief for the father she'd loved despite his flaws, relief that they'd found reconciliation before the end. "Are you all right?" Wyatt asked softly as they walked back from the cemetery. "I will be," Grace replied, leaning against him. "I'm glad he came, glad we had that time. In the days that followed, life gradually returned to its rhythms. Grace threw herself into preparations for the school term while Wyatt worked with Thomas on plans to expand their horse breeding operation. The deed to the Wyoming land remained locked in a small box in the cabin, its future undecided. "We should discuss what you want to do about the land," Wyatt said one evening as they sat by the river, their special place. Grace sighed, watching the water flow past. "I don't know. Part of me wants to sell it, use the money to build our future here. But it was my mother's land, the one thing my father didn't touch. That means something." "It does," Wyatt agreed. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. We could visit it sometime, see it for ourselves." "I'd like that," Grace said, resting her head on his shoulder. "But not until after the wedding and after the school term starts. I have commitments here." The mention of the wedding brought a smile to Wyatt's face. In just 3 weeks, they would be married in the small church in Riversbend. Sarah had helped Grace sew a simple but elegant wedding dress, and Thomas had insisted on hosting the celebration at the ranch afterward. "Mrs. Grace Jones," Wyatt mused. "Has a nice ring to it," Grace laughed. "Better than Mrs. Malcolm Pierce, that's certain." As August arrived, bringing with it the hottest days of summer, word came from Sweetwater that Malcolm Pierce was still searching for Walter Whitaker, growing increasingly frustrated by his disappearance. The news brought a measure of satisfaction to Grace. Her father had denied Pierce to the end, protecting her even in his final days. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect late summer day that seemed made for new beginnings. Grace stood in the small room at the back of the church, Sarah helping with the final adjustments to her dress, a creation of ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simple but elegant. "You look beautiful," Sarah said, adjusting the wreath of wildflowers in Grace's hair. "Wyatt won't know what hit him," Grace smiled, touching the pearl ring on her finger soon to be joined by a gold band. "I never imagined this, you know. When I ran across those plains, I was only thinking of escape, not of finding a home, a family, love. Sometimes we find exactly what we need when we're running from something else," Sarah observed wisely. "Ready," Grace nodded, gathering her small bouquet of late summer blooms. Thomas was waiting to walk her down the aisle, an honor he'd requested after Walter's death. As the church door opened and the small gathering of friends rose to their feet, Grace saw only Wyatt, standing tall and handsome at the altar, his eyes filled with love as they met hers. Each step toward him felt right, as if she'd been moving in this direction her entire life. When Thomas placed her hand in Wyatt's, the warmth of his touch steadied her racing heart. "You're beautiful," Wyatt whispered as they turned to face the minister. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, their vows spoken clearly for all to hear, promises to love, honor, and cherish, to face life's challenges together, to build a future based on mutual respect and unwavering love. When Wyatt slipped the gold band onto her finger to join the pearl ring, Grace felt a sense of completion, of coming home in the truest sense. Their kiss was sweet and full of promise, the beginning of a lifetime together. The celebration at the Reed Ranch lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing. Grace, whirling in Wyatt's arms beneath lanterns strung from the cottonwood trees, had never felt so happy or so certain of her path. As the party wound down, the couple slipped away to the cabin, no longer just Grace's, but theirs now, freshly painted and filled with flowers for the occasion. Inside, they stood for a moment, suddenly shy despite the weeks of growing closeness. "Mrs. Jones," Wyatt said softly, touching her cheek. "My wife, my husband," Grace replied, loving the sound of the word. "The man who rode beside me when I ran, and I always will," Wyatt promised, gathering her close. "Wherever you go, whatever pace you set, I'll be there matching it step for all the days of our lives." Their kiss sealed the promise, the first of many as husband and wife, the beginning of a future neither could have imagined on that dusty plain where they'd first met. As summer gave way to fall, Grace and Wyatt settled into married life with a joy that made even ordinary days feel special. The new schoolhouse was completed just in time for the term to begin, and Grace took to teaching with a natural aptitude that endeared her to both the children and their parents. Wyatt and Thomas's horse breeding business prospered, their reputation for quality stock spreading beyond Riverspend. Occasionally, news would reach them of Malcolm Pierce still searching, still determined, but the threat seemed increasingly distant as they built their life together in the community that had embraced them. The deed to the Wyoming land remained in its box, a decision for another day. On a crisp December morning, with snow dusting the ground and the river beginning to freeze at its edges, Grace woke early, a secret smile on her lips. Later that day, as they decorated their small cabin for their first Christmas together, she shared the news she'd been savoring. "Wyatt," she said, handing him a small package wrapped in brown paper. An early Christmas gift. Inside was a tiny pair of knitted booties. Wyatt stared at them, uncomprehending for a moment, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "Grace, are you?" She nodded, her eyes bright with happy tears. "In June, we're having a baby." The joy on his face was everything she'd hoped for. He lifted her gently, spinning her around the cabin before setting her down with exaggerated care. "A baby," he whispered, placing a hand on her still flat stomach. "Our child." "A new adventure," Grace agreed, covering his hand with her own. "Are you ready?" Wyatt's smile was radiant as he drew her close. "With you, always." Standing there in the warm cabin, snow falling gently outside the windows, Grace thought back to that desperate day on the plains, when she'd run with no destination in mind, only the fierce determination to choose her own path. How far she'd come since, then from a woman fleeing a future she didn't want to one embracing a future beyond her wildest dreams. All because a cowboy had ridden beside her, matching her pace, seeing not a woman in flight but a spirit as free and determined as his own. As Wyatt kissed her, Grace knew with absolute certainty that whatever the future held, challenges, joys, the approaching miracle of their child, they would face it together, side by side, step for step, their paths forever intertwined on the journey they'd begun that day on the golden plains of Montana.